The morning Raymond Holt almost lost everything, he was wearing a borrowed tie. It was the kind of detail that didn't matter to anyone else in that building. Not to the lawyers in their pressed suits. Not to the bank representatives with their leather portfolios. Not to the cluster of executives who had been whispering in the hallway since 7 in the morning. But Raymond noticed it because the tie had belonged to his father, a man who had worked 40 years at a meatpacking plant in Omaha and never once complained about it. The tie was dark blue with a faint diagonal stripe. Raymond had found it in a shoebox at the back of his closet the night before when he was trying to find something, anything, that felt like solid ground. He was 38 years old. He had a daughter named Bea, who was 9, who liked to draw horses in the margins of her homework and who still on bad nights climbed into his bed and tucked herself under his arm like she had when she was 4. He had a company he had built over 11 years from nothing. A regional logistics firm called Holt Supply Bridge that moved goods between small manufacturers and mid-sized retailers across 5 Midwestern states. He had 43 employees, most of whom had been with him longer than a decade. And as of that morning, he had 48 hours before the bank called the loan that would unravel everything. He hadn't slept. His eyes felt like sandpaper. He'd made Bee's lunch at 6 in the morning, a turkey sandwich, an apple, a handful of crackers she liked, and driven her to school without telling her anything was wrong. She'd kissed him on the cheek before jumping out of the car. He'd watched her run through the front doors of Millard Elementary in her yellow backpack and then sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes, not moving, not thinking, just breathing. Then he drove downtown. The conference room at Callaway and Strand Financial was on the 14th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Missouri River. On any other day, Raymond would have noticed the view. That morning he saw nothing but the table, a long oval of polished mahogany with a stack of documents at one end, all of them waiting for his signature. The documents were the restructuring agreement. In plain language, it meant that Holt Supply Bridge would be transferred to a holding group controlled by Callaway and Strand. Raymond would receive a small settlement, a non-compete clause stretching 5 years, and a handshake. His 43 employees, Gerald in the loading dock who'd worked there since the beginning, young Lily in dispatch who was putting herself through school, would be evaluated for retention, which everyone in the room knew meant roughly half of them would be gone within 6 months. This was what bankruptcy looked like when the banks got to it first. Not a collapse, but a quiet, organized dismantling. Raymond sat at the far end of the table. Across from him were 3 men from Callaway and Strand, their lead attorney, whose name was Patrick Greer, a financial officer named Douglas, and a man Raymond had never met before who had been introduced simply as a stakeholder representative. Beside Raymond sat his own attorney, a tired-looking woman named Carol Abrams who had told him the night before, as gently as she could, that she didn't see another path. "We're ready when you are, Mr. Holt," Patrick Greer said. Raymond looked at the pen in front of him. It was a heavy pen, the kind they kept in conference rooms for exactly this purpose, for the signing of things that couldn't be unsigned. He thought about his father's tie. He thought about Bea and her yellow backpack. He picked up the pen. What happened next was not dramatic. There was no sudden noise, no interruption from a door bursting open. What happened was small and quiet and almost nothing. The door to the conference room opened about 4 inches, and a man leaned his head in. He was wearing a gray maintenance uniform with the building's logo on the chest. He looked to be somewhere in his late 40s, maybe 50, with calloused hands and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. He was holding a clipboard. "Sorry," he said, looking genuinely embarrassed. "Wrong floor. I'll come back for the HVAC check." Patrick Greer waved a dismissive hand without looking up. "Close the door, please." The man started to pull the door shut, and then he stopped. His eyes had landed on the table, specifically on the stack of financial documents spread across it. He stood there for just a moment, long enough that it became slightly awkward. His expression shifted. It was not the expression of a man recognizing something. It was more like the expression of someone who has just noticed a word misspelled on a public sign. A small, involuntary frown, the brain catching something before the person even knew what they'd seen. "Sir," he said. He was speaking to Raymond. Patrick Greer looked up now, his tone sharp. "We're in the middle of a private meeting." The man ignored him. He was still looking at Raymond. "I don't mean to intrude, but I used to work in freight logistics 15 years before I had to take this job. And I can see from here that column in the 3rd section." He paused. "Something looks wrong with your receivables projection." The room went quiet. Patrick Greer set down his own pen. "Excuse me? I'm not trying to cause trouble," the man said. He had a steady voice. Not confrontational, just honest. "But that figure, the one in the Q3 forward column, it looks like it's pulling from a different base rate than the rest of the document. I could be wrong. I'm not an accountant. But I spent a lot of years reading numbers like that, and something in there doesn't add up the way it should. Carol Abrams was looking at him now. So was Raymond. Patrick Greer stood. He was a tall man, and he used his height the way some people used volume, to communicate that the conversation was over. This is a closed financial proceeding. I need you to leave now. The maintenance man held up both hands, the clipboard in one of them. I'm leaving, He looked at Raymond one more time. There was something in his face that Raymond would think about later, something that looked less like interference and more like recognition, like one tired man seeing another. Check page 9, he said. Column 4, the receivables rollover. And then he stepped back and closed the door. The room stayed quiet for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Raymond put down the pen. Raymond, Carol said quietly. Give me a minute, we really should. Give me a minute, Carol. He pulled the documents toward him. Page 9 was part of the financial projection appendix, the kind of section that attorneys summarized and principals were expected to take on faith. Raymond was not a trained accountant, but he had built his company by understanding every number that moved through it. He knew his receivables. He knew what his clients owed and when and how the timing of those payments affected his liquidity position. He found column 4. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the previous quarter's baseline, which was referenced in a footnote at the bottom of the page. Then he looked at the forward projection again. His chest tightened. The rollover figure, the amount being projected as receivable income in the coming quarter, which was being used as part of the justification for the loan default, was calculated using a base rate from 18 months ago. Not the current rate, not even the rate from the previous quarter. 18 months ago, when 2 of Raymond's largest clients had been in a temporary contract renegotiation period and his receivables had been running unusually low. In other words, the financial model being used to justify calling his loan was built on a number that hadn't been accurate for over a year. He looked up. Patrick Greer was watching him. Something in the man's expression had shifted, a slight tightening around the eyes, a stillness that hadn't been there before. This receivables projection, Raymond said, it's using the Q2 base rate from 2 years ago. The model was prepared by our financial team, Patrick Greer said. I know it was, and I'm telling you it's using the wrong base rate. Raymond's voice was controlled. Barely, but it was. My current receivables run about 31% higher than what this column is showing. I can pull the actual invoices. I can pull the payment records. This number is wrong. Douglas, the financial officer, leaned forward and pulled the document toward himself. He looked at column 4. He looked at the footnote. And then he looked at Patrick Greer with an expression that was very carefully neutral. Carol Abrams had her own copy open now. She was very still. Raymond, she said, and her voice had changed. We need to take a recess. They broke for 40 minutes. Raymond sat in a waiting room on the 14th floor and drank a cup of bad coffee and did not allow himself to think too far ahead. He called no one. He simply sat with his father's tie and the sound of his own heartbeat. When Carol came back, she sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. Their model is wrong, she said. Not slightly wrong, materially wrong. The base rate error changes the entire liquidity picture. Your actual receivables, properly calculated, put you above the covenant threshold. You're not in default, Raymond. You never were. He heard the words. He understood them, but it took him a moment to feel them. What does that mean? It means they cannot call the loan. Not today. Not without fraud exposure, if they try to push it. She paused. It means you walk out of here today with your company. Raymond Holt put his elbows on the table and pressed his face into his hands. He stayed that way for about 30 seconds, long enough to get through whatever was trying to come out of him. Then he sat up and straightened his father's tie. Okay, he said. Okay, Carol agreed. The meeting reconvened. It was brief and cold and nothing like what it had been 2 hours earlier. Patrick Greer did most of the talking in the careful, measured language of a man constructing distance between himself and a problem. There was discussion of a model recalibration, of pending review, of reconvening at a later date. Raymond said very little. He didn't need to say much. Carol did the necessary talking with the particular quiet precision of a lawyer who had just found herself holding a better hand than she'd expected. Raymond signed nothing. He rode the elevator down alone. In the lobby, the floors were a pale marble that reflected the overhead lights in long, wavering streaks. There were a few people moving through, a courier with a cart, a woman on her phone, 2 suits heading toward the revolving door. And there, near the building's service entrance, sitting on an upturned equipment bucket and eating a sandwich, was the man in the gray maintenance uniform. Raymond walked over. The man looked up and seemed surprised to see him, not alarmed, just surprised. The meeting's over, Raymond said. Yeah, the man's face was carefully neutral. Yeah, Raymond paused. I didn't sign. Something moved behind the man's eyes. Not triumph, just something quieter than that. Relief, maybe. Or simply the satisfaction of a thing that had needed to be said being said. Good, the man said. Raymond sat down on a nearby bench. It felt strange, a man in a borrowed tie sitting in a lobby talking to a man eating lunch from a paper bag. But he stayed. You said you worked in freight logistics, 15 years. Mid-size carrier out of Des Moines. The man's name, Raymond would learn, was Patrick Dillard. He said it like it didn't require any ceremony, just Patrick. He'd run dispatch operations, then moved into financial oversight when his company expanded, until the company didn't expand anymore, and he found himself at 46 trying to figure out what came next. He'd taken the maintenance job 14 months ago. It paid steady, the hours let him be home when he needed to be, and he hadn't yet figured out what the next thing was. You have kids? Raymond asked. Patrick reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He showed Raymond a photo without saying anything. A girl maybe 12 or 13, standing in front of a blue school bus in a puffy winter coat, squinting into the sun and smiling the way kids smile when they're trying not to look too happy. Her name's Addie, Patrick said. She's 13. She lives with her mom most of the year. I have her summers and every other holiday. He put the phone away. It's not what I wanted, but it's what we figured out. Raymond nodded. He knew the particular arithmetic of that kind of arrangement, the way you measured time differently when it came in installments. I have a daughter too, Raymond said. Bay. She's 9. He paused. She doesn't know what almost happened today. Patrick didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, Mine never knows either. I think that's probably right. They shouldn't have to carry that. They sat for a minute in the quiet of the lobby. A security guard near the front desk was pretending not to watch them. Outside, a delivery truck was double parked on the street, its hazard lights blinking in the noon glare. Why did you stop? Raymond asked. You could have just closed the door. Patrick thought about it. I don't know exactly. I've been on the wrong end of bad numbers before, watched my company make decisions based on projections that weren't right. A lot of people lost jobs over it. He paused. I guess I looked at you and I thought, there's a man about to sign something he shouldn't sign. And I didn't want to be someone who saw that and kept walking. Raymond looked at him. You didn't know me. No, Patrick said. I didn't. There was something in that, in the plainness of it, that Raymond found harder to respond to than anything else that had happened that morning. He had spent 11 years building a company on the logic of relationships and trust and reasonable risk. He understood incentive. He understood self-interest. He did not always understand the simple human impulse to stop, when stopping cost you something and earned you nothing. I'd like to offer you a job, Raymond said. Patrick looked at him sideways. I'm eating my lunch. I know, I'm serious. Raymond leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Not charity, I mean an actual job. I need someone in financial oversight who can read a freight operations model and also knows what real-world numbers look like when they're wrong. That's not a common combination. He paused. I can't pay you what you were probably making at your peak, but I can pay you better than this building is, and you'd have flexibility on your schedule for when Addie's in town. Patrick was quiet for a while. He finished his sandwich. He folded the paper bag carefully, the way people do when they've learned not to waste things. I'd want to see the books first, he said. Before I agreed to anything. Raymond almost laughed. That's exactly the right answer. He stood and extended his hand. Patrick looked at it for a moment, then stood and shook it. His grip was firm. Raymond's father would have called it an honest handshake, which meant nothing slippery and nothing trying to prove a point. I have to pick up my daughter at 3, Patrick said. Go pick up your daughter, Raymond said. Come by the office Thursday morning. Ask for Raymond. Patrick nodded. He picked up his clipboard and his equipment bag. One more thing, Raymond said. Patrick stopped. That column. Column 4 on page 9. You saw that from across a room through a 4-inch gap in the door. The formatting was off, Patrick said simply. When numbers don't flow right, the spacing looks different. You start to notice it after a while. He shrugged. Also, the font was slightly smaller in that section. Usually means it was pulled from a different source document. Raymond stared at him. Patrick said and walked back toward the service hallway. Raymond stood in the lobby for a moment longer. Then he took out his phone and did something he had been holding off doing all morning. He called his office. Gerald picked up on the second ring the way he always did. How'd it go, boss? Raymond looked out through the revolving door at the street. Sunlight on concrete. A woman pushing a stroller. Normal life, doing what it did. We're still here, Raymond said. Gerald was quiet for a second, then he said, Yeah, tell Lily, tell everyone. He paused. I'll explain the details later. But we're still here. He ended the call and stood for another moment, his hand in his pocket, his father's tie hanging straight. The building hummed around him. 14 floors above, there were lawyers doing the methodical, unemotional work of revising a position they had held with great confidence 2 hours ago. In a few weeks, there would be letters and formal reviews and careful documentation of what had gone wrong with the financial model. There would be no acknowledgement of the man in the gray uniform, because acknowledging him would require acknowledging everything else. Raymond didn't need them to acknowledge it. He walked out through the revolving door. The air outside was sharp and cold, the way early November air in Omaha gets, direct, with no patience for anything that isn't real. He called B's school and got her teacher's voicemail and left a message saying he would be there at pickup himself today, which he hadn't been able to do in weeks. Then he walked 2 blocks to where he'd parked, got into his car, and drove east toward the river. He didn't have a reason to drive that way. He just drove. There was a small park along the riverbank that he and Bea used to go to on Sunday afternoons when she was younger, before the company had grown to the point where Sundays started to look like every other day. There was a bench there with a view of the water and a hot dog cart that operated on some internal schedule nobody had ever been able to predict. Raymond had eaten a lot of uncertain hot dogs at that bench over the years. He and Bea had turned it into a game, guessing whether the cart would be there or not and what the stakes were if they were wrong. He pulled over and sat in the car looking at the river. He thought about Patrick Dillard eating a sandwich on an upturned equipment bucket at noon, and the way he'd said, "I didn't want to be someone who saw that," and kept walking. He thought about the photo of Addie in the puffy winter coat. He thought about how a man could spend 15 years building expertise in something and then have circumstances take it away. Not through any fault of his own, just through the ordinary cruelty of timing, and still show up to work the next day in a gray uniform, and still, when it mattered, be the smartest person in a room full of people who had never doubted their own intelligence. He thought about Bea. He thought about the morning she had been born. 36 hours of labor and then a very long wait, and then a nurse handing him a small person, wrapped in a white blanket, who looked at him with the unfocused, ancient gaze of someone who had just arrived from a very long distance and wasn't sure yet what to make of where she'd landed. He had held her in both arms in a hospital room in the gray November dawn, almost exactly 9 years ago now, and made no particular promises out loud, because he wasn't that kind of man. But he had made them in the silent animal way that new fathers make promises, in the part of the chest that doesn't have words. He had promised that he would figure it out. He had not always figured it out. There had been years when the company was struggling, and he was running on 4 hours of sleep, and Bea was being raised on a diet of drive-through food and morning cartoons because he didn't have the time or energy to do better. There had been a period after her mother had left, quietly, without drama, the way some people exit with a text message and a suitcase, when Raymond had been genuinely unsure whether he was managing anything or simply surviving it. He had called his own father during that period more than he had in the previous decade. His father had not offered advice, mostly. He had just stayed on the phone. Sometimes that was the thing that was needed. His father was gone now. 4 years ago, a Tuesday morning, a phone call Raymond had known was coming and been unprepared for anyway. He sat with the river for a while longer. Then he drove to Millard Elementary and parked in the pickup line and waited, like dozens of other parents, for the bell to ring. When it did, the front doors burst open and children poured out in the particular chaos of 3 o'clock freedom. Coats half on, backpacks swinging, voices at a volume that suggested a full day of enforced quiet had been building toward this exact release. Raymond scanned the crowd. He saw the yellow backpack first. Bea was walking with her friend Charlotte, the two of them deep in a conversation that involved considerable hand gestures. Then, Bea looked up and saw his car and stopped mid-sentence. She stood still for just a moment in the middle of all the moving children looking at him. Then she ran. She pulled the door open and threw herself into the passenger seat, and her backpack collided with the dashboard. And she said, "Dad, you're here." "I'm here," he said. "You're never here on Thursdays. It's Wednesday." "I know." She was already pulling off her coat. "Charlotte's mom picks me up on Wednesdays, and you're never here and you're here." She looked at him with the specific scrutiny of a 9-year-old who has learned that when routines break, there is usually a reason. Did something happen? He looked at her brown hair escaping from a ponytail. A smear of something blue on her left thumb, which was probably paint. She had his eyes and her mother's nose and a face that was entirely her own. "Everything's good," he said. "I just wanted to be here." She studied him for another second. Then she seemed to decide this was an acceptable answer because she clicked her seatbelt and turned to face forward. "Can we go to the river place?" she said. "The hot dog cart might not be there. I know. That's the point." She looked at him sideways. "I say it is. You say it isn't. If you're wrong, you buy me ice cream." Raymond pulled out of the parking lot. "Deal," he said. The cart was not there. It was never there when it should have been. He bought her a soft-serve cone from a gas station 2 blocks down instead, which she accepted as a reasonable substitute, and they sat on the bench by the river in the November cold, Bea eating her ice cream with the focused determination of someone who had earned it, Raymond watching the water move. She leaned against his arm. He let her. The river went south, the way it always did, the way it would be going, long after both of them were gone, carrying whatever the land gave it, indifferent and patient and vast. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, your tie looks old." He looked down at it, the dark blue stripe. The slight fraying at the tip his father had never gotten around to fixing. It was Grandpa's. Bea was quiet for a moment, working on her cone. Then she said, "Do you miss him a lot?" "Yeah," Raymond said. "I do. Do you think he would have liked me?" He put his arm around her. She was 9 years old and small, and she smelled like school and tempera paint, and the particular clean smell of a child who had been running around all day in the open air. "He would have thought you were the best thing that ever happened," Raymond said. "In his whole life. He would have told you that constantly." Bea considered this with appropriate seriousness. Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. "Good," she said. The river moved. The air smelled like cold water and dead leaves and the faint diesel edge of the city. On the far bank, a heron stood absolutely still in the shallows, watching the surface for something only it could see. Raymond watched it. Bea finished her cone and tucked her hands inside her coat sleeves and watched it too. Later, he would try to explain to people why that moment felt like the one that mattered. Not the conference room, not the documents, not even the lobby conversation. People expected the meaningful moment to be the one where something changed. But it wasn't. The meaningful moment was the bench and the river and the heron and Bea's weight against his arm, and the fact that he was there to feel it. He had almost signed it away, not just the company. This, the ordinary, unremarkable afternoon of being exactly where he was. He thought about Patrick Dillard stopping in a doorway when he didn't have to. A man who had lost things. A career, a daily life with his daughter, the years he'd spent building something that got taken apart, and still stopped. Still said something. Still decided that being a person who kept walking was not who he wanted to be. There was a kind of courage in that Raymond did not have a name for. It wasn't bravery in any dramatic sense. It wasn't sacrifice. It was smaller than that and quieter and somehow more demanding, the daily choice to stay present to what was happening around you, even when you were tired, even when it cost you something, even when no one was going to notice or thank you for it. Patrick Dillard had noticed because he'd spent 15 years learning to read numbers in freight documents. He'd stopped because of who he was. Those were two different things. And Raymond thought that the second one was the one that mattered. He didn't know what Thursday would bring. He didn't know if Patrick would show up, or if the job would work out, or if the company would fully clear the legal aftermath of that morning without lasting damage. He didn't know a lot of things. He was a 38-year-old man who had built something real and almost watched it disappear, and was sitting on a bench by the Missouri River with his daughter leaning against him and a dead man's tie around his neck. And he didn't know what came next. But Bea was warm beside him. The heron hadn't moved. The river was going south the way it always did. That was enough. For this particular afternoon on this particular bench, that was exactly enough.